Greetings and welcome to conversations on COVID and development here at the Center for Global Development. Today I'm really very happy to have with us Vera Songwe, who is the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. And Vera has been really in the forefront of helping to craft a response position of African leaders on the crisis and on its response. And I hope that we'll be able to have a conversation today that covers both developments on the ground and the international response to support Africa during this. So, Vera, welcome. Very happy to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Very happy to be with you today. Thank you very much.
So, Vera, I thought, you have been meeting regularly and with your own colleagues and with African finance ministers and other ministers. Today, here we are a few weeks, maybe actually even a few months into this crisis. The direct health sector impact has thankfully been a little more muted than some people had feared at the beginning, although there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know whether this is just early in the cycle and things are going to get worse. But it is already clear that the economic consequences, both of the crisis and of the shutdowns, lockdowns in a number of countries, the closing of links with the rest of the world, slowdown of the rest of the world, is already beginning to have an impact on many economies. And as a result, you've seen a lot of agencies, whether it's the IMF, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the UN, have all started talking about sort of worst economic outlook this year in Africa that they've seen in many decades. And I wanted to get a little bit your sense of how you and your colleagues are now looking at the economic prospects. Do you think that it's going to be concentrated in a few types of economies, the commodity exporters, the ones that are most directly hit? Do you see this as being a more broad-based impact? Are you now thinking that people have anticipated as bad as it's likely to get, or are ministers and you feeling that maybe things could actually get a little bit worse in the economic front?
Thank you, Masood. Always a pleasure. I think, when the crisis started, and you do say it well, we on the continent, we're all looking towards a health crisis first. And but then when we did our first study, we realized that the health crisis hadn't reached the continent yet, but the effects of the economic crisis were fully and squarely embedded already in all the economies of the continent. And at the time, we were optimistic. Africa was supposed to grow at 3.2% in 2020, which already is not, as we all know, the numbers are not anything to brag about, but at least there was some positive growth. We had come from 2.4, so we were sort of turning the curve after a slump in commodity prices in 2014. And then we realized that this was actually hitting the economies quite substantially and across the board, to answer your question. It wasn't just some economies, as you said, because the African economy is so diverse, but the combination of a health pandemic and an economic recession, particularly in our large trading partners in China, in Europe, in the United States, meant that there was an indiscriminate sort of impact on the continent. Secondly, what we saw was the interruption in the supply chain. Trade literally stopped for everybody. It didn't matter what you were trading on or in, and trade stopped. We, as the Economic Commission for Africa, are probably privileged because we are one of the institutions that covers all of Africa. So we look at North, South, East, and West. And when we run our numbers, what we saw was a particularly severe impacts on all of the continent. Of course, in Central Africa, it's mostly a commodity-based sub-region. So oil prices slumped, Angola is the poster child in that sort of category of countries. But in North Africa, we have Algeria. But in North Africa, we have Morocco, we have Egypt, which are tourism economies, Tunisia, all of that. But Egypt in particular, also with trade and the Suez Canal, where because of the interruption in global supply chains, trade in that region also slumped. East Africa is the region for us which was growing the fastest, had projected growth overall that was going to be in the orders of 6-7%, because of course we have in East Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, that are quite diversified economies and that we're growing quite fast. But even in those economies, again, tourism, in Rwanda, Uganda, the interruption of supply chains in agriculture made it such that even a diversified economy like Uganda and Kenya could not sort of make it through the crisis in the way that we would have liked to see it happen. So across the board, all of these economies suffering. We are now projecting from 3.2 in March, late March, we were thinking 1.1, it will go down to 1.1 growth. I think now we are hovering around 0%. We're still being a little bit optimistic. We don't want to start getting into negative territory. But if, the IMF continues the projections that they have for the global economy, we may have to see a revision of that. We are taking some comfort in the fact that, the US economy seems to be sort of coming back. Europe has given itself a second stimulus, and maybe that will pick up a little bit and boost some growth. One of the things that we're doing and we're beginning to look at more closely is intra-Africa consumption. And hopefully from there and strengthening the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, we may see some fragments of growth, but it's not going to be, I think, anything near where we expected.
Now, what about next year? Because I think, in a way, people are talking about, sort of still a bit of a V-shaped recovery. I have to say, personally, I'm a little less sure how quickly you can recover. But even if the GDP numbers recover, it takes a lot longer to pick up on the other aggregates. And I think a lot depends, doesn't it, on what happens to the productive base during this period and how much you can maintain and support this. How do you assess that effort now? In the rich countries, a lot of the stimulus has been spent on keeping small businesses going. And of course, a lot of countries in Africa, both constraints on the amount of resources available and also constraints in terms of the instruments to support those small businesses, make it much harder to do that. So how do you feel and think about that now?
I think two things. One of the things that we have tried to do, but especially the countries, and a lot of credit must go to the African countries themselves. We have just been looking at sort of what has been the magnitude of the stimulus packages that have been sort of launched and announced by African countries themselves. And we see that, we talk $44.7 billion is the sort of internal stimulus package of the continent. Of course, our GDP is $2.3 trillion, so 44 is 0.5, nowhere near the 8, 10, 12 trillion dollars that the G20 has given itself. I'm still thinking of adding to it. But a lot of that stimulus, I think, has gone exactly to where it needed to go, which was protecting the existing small businesses. So it's $44 billion, of which $20 billion is from South Africa, $6.3 billion for Egypt. So that takes half of the sort of varied stimulus package away. But, what we have seen in Egypt, for example, is the support to small business, the sort of moratorium on tax payment for 3 months, the drop in the sort of, they have cut the energy prices in half so that small business doesn't have to sort of spend liquidity on the energy bill. So there has been a lot in the policy direction that has been taken by African governments to shore up, the small and medium enterprises. This is true, and this holds for I would say largely the formal sector and the formal SMEs. When you now go to countries maybe like Kenya and Ivory Coast, who've also taken similar measures, but where the small and medium enterprises are mostly in the informal sector, some of these measures may not necessarily reach them with the speed, the rapidity, and the intensity in which it is required for it to sort of begin to have an adequate ripple effects. And then, of course, you have issues around the governance processes. But there are things that Kenya has done, for example, reduce the cost of money transfers. This is sort of a unanimous, support process which helps everybody equally. But I think the easiest thing to do for our governments will be to find ways of supporting first the SMEs and keeping them in business. Of course, in Europe and in the United States, part of the stimulus in the US has been to pay employees not to fire their employers even though they're not coming to work. Because of the informality of the African economy, we really cannot launch a stimulus package like that. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult to sort of ensure that we protect small businesses. But some of the things that some of the governments have been trying to put in place is on the sort of procurement processes of state procurement processes is to see whether we can they can give more contracts to the SMEs. This, of course, leads to arrears issues and other things, which also are sort of a deadly point for our small and medium enterprises. But we are pushing as ECA to get all the arrears payments done so that all the sort of local government suppliers have some liquidity to sort of stay afloat. But it is still very challenging.
I think, that, as you say, it's going to be challenging. I think the last thing you want is that, in a way, the stimulus packages are financed through arrears in the economy, because that's really taking away from, with one hand, what you try to give with the other, and you're actually taking away more in many cases than you can provide, and it's not a good way. And I would say that.
And domestic arrears mean that you're actually taking away from the small slice that is the formal
small
sector.
Supply. Yeah. Yes. Because actually the larger enterprises are probably the well-connected ones that are often first in the queue to get their arrears paid.
Or the external ones who have the IMF batting for them.
Well, exactly. So I think it's the small business holder that has the greatest difficulty in sort of making sure that they're paid. And they're the ones that are most vulnerable and don't have the ability to sustain without that cash flow coming in. But overall, it's really quite exciting and encouraging, I find, to see the innovation and creativity that has come about in so many African countries in terms of the ways they've found to reach different kinds of economic agents, in the way people have scaled up cash transfers. They've used mobile technology to reduce the cost of reducing the cost of transfers of funding. So I think that there are different ways in which people have been using mobile technology as well in this area, and all that I find really quite encouraging. Maybe some things that we can retain thereafter and also learn from in the rest of the world, actually.
Yeah, I think, something that I'm very passionate about, in addition to discussing the debt issues, is we came together with we started off with the 4 largest telco companies on the continent. We're now at 9 telco companies, all together representing about 460 million mobile devices on the continent. And what we have been able to do, we'll launch it next week, but we've tested it now in 2 countries, is we've gotten all the telco companies, the first time ever on the continent, to use one smart code to communicate with the users. But not just the one-way communication where you get a message on your phone and you can respond, but it's going to be a 2-way communication. And this is very linked to the last question, because when the crisis started, we thought, oh my God, the informal sector is going to be the most vulnerable, 70% of our population. We are committing to good governance. We're committing to transparency in the allocation of safety nets. But the people who need the safety nets the most, we cannot reach them. So what's the easiest way of reaching them? They may not be registered in the tax bureau. They may not have an ID, but they have a phone. So we called together the telco companies and we said, how can you help us? And they came and said, we can come together, we can get one code, send it out for every country. And so we could actually, if we launch this platform, ask a question and get 30 million responses. We're going to be reaching 460 million devices. And you could immediately say, did you get a ration today? And people can come back to you and say, yes, I did. No, I didn't. And you could trace the location. So it's a combination of the SSIDs, or sort of the SMS type phones, because actually only 27% of the continent has Android phones.
Yeah.
And this is something that we are actually now beginning to have a different discussion, and is to say, if anything, COVID has now shown the importance and the sort of dire criticality of internet connectivity, accessibility, and affordability for the continent, because we can do so much more. We can keep small businesses open if we had platforms where they could sell and trade their goods without the need for distance and travel in the ways that we do it today. So I think that there is a space there for one policy, but also this kinds of innovations have never happened before. And it is one of the, to your point on innovation, the biggest innovation, and I hope it keeps, is really the sort of cross-sectoral, multi-stakeholder coming together to find solutions. It's not just the state or the central government that is looking for solutions. We have mayors, we have telco companies, we have logistics companies. I give you an example. One of the problems that we quickly ran into was food prices. And we thought, oh my God, food prices are going to go up. And so we had securities companies saying, oh, but we have stocking reserves, we have empty reserves across the continent. We can share that with you so that you can ask farmers to come and store their goods in our locations and ensure that, as you know, 40% of our agricultural products gets lost in storage and transportation. So it's just been an amazing but very heartwarming, I think, show of support, of collaboration, and of collective action that we hope we can keep post the crisis. Of course, we've had the amazing innovations of $1 pack test kits from Senegal with the young, kids who are developing that, and that gives us a sense also of sort of the cutting edge science and technology that you can find on the continent when we put our minds to it.
So I think that's a nice segue. I want to talk a little bit about the support the rest of the world is providing. And this sort of, as you said, is heartwarming to see the collaboration, the coming together. And of course, we've had some important statements of support from the rest of the world. In terms of actual support on the ground so far, I have to say personally, I feel it falls a bit short of those statements. We had this debt initiative that was announced for the poorest countries, many of which are in Africa, for the bilateral official debt that they owed. As far as I can tell, only a few have actually seen the benefits of it yet, although more are applying for it, and some are not applying for it. We can talk a bit about why that is. And we've also had some ramping up from the international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, the African Bank. But the amounts are running so far in the sort of the low tens of billions of dollars, rather than the kinds of hundreds of billions that are likely to be needed during the next year. And I wanted to get a little bit of your sense first of the sort of aggregate response. I mean, do you feel that there's a bit of a stalling of momentum here, or do you think we're actually going full steam ahead? We just haven't seen the results yet. So, this is sort of classic. How should we think about where we'll be in 6 months' time if we stay on the current trajectory?
This is a great question, and one of the questions and the worries that we all have now. Let's start with the beginning of the question, which is, what is the support, and then is it fading away or fizzling out? I may say, and then is it at the right levels? So I think, again, when we started the conversation with the African finance ministers somewhere in the middle of March, at the time everybody was waiting for the big health whammy and images of bodies across the continent, because we didn't have the right PPEs and our hospital beds per person were not adequate and all that. Thankfully, that didn't happen, but what we got was a huge economic hit. And so I think the first reaction maybe from the global community was surprise. What's happening? Why isn't Africa getting the health crisis? And so there was a need maybe for just time to take it in. The beauty of it was that, the finance ministers on the continent, the Economic Commission for Africa, we put out this report that immediately sort of showed the magnitude of the economic damage, and at the same time called for some kind of relief immediately. And thankfully, the IMF, the World Bank immediately responded saying, yes, we believe that some sort of debt relief is going to be important and needed. So this was the high point. And at the time we had called for debt relief for all of Africa. And I want to come back to this point because there is this sort of segmentation of the continent, which we believe is sometimes not very effective and doesn't sort of appreciate Africa's journey over the last 40 years as a continent. So, the IMF, the World Bank all came out and said, yes, we believe that this is a great idea. 2 weeks later, we put out another call being a lot more specific, saying as $100 billion stimulus the continent will need, at least in the short run, a 2-year debt standstill across the board, some support for the private sector in the form of special drawing rights, which would allow for more foreign exchange and to support exactly the SMEs we were talking about. The IMF went forward, and I'm very happy to say, and immediately afforded debt relief, which means actually a cancellation almost of service payments and principal for 19 African countries, to the tune of about $226 million. So that was not a lot, but we also all know that Africa's debt has shifted a little bit from more sort of multilateral concessional lending into bilateral and private sector debt. We were very, very pleased to see the G20 come out, soon after, and also announce a debt service suspension initiative, now commonly called the DSSI. And the G20 DSSI went further because it didn't just say it's the Paris Club. It said Paris Club plus 7. Paris Club plus 7, I think the important one of the 7 was China. And we all know that Africa's debt to China is about $150 billion. We estimate that the ECA about $8.2 billion in debt service payments in the next 18 months. So for us, that would have been a huge boost in the process. And they had not just the low-income countries, but so the IMF gave debt relief to exactly the poorest, really low-income countries. We made a little bit of advocacy and lobbying, most of us, including yourselves, to say let's broaden the net a little bit. They went further and they threw in LDCs, and that allowed us to sort of take the blend countries into account, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, Kenya, and the rest. But then they also added Angola, which was a sort of nice and interesting touch that the G20 put in there. And so we had a slightly broader net. We still didn't have all of Africa, which is what the finance ministers called for. And the reason we were calling for all of Africa was because we didn't want to look at GDP per capita or GDP as the indicator, but we wanted to measure vulnerability. And at some point I had indicated that, Egypt, Seychelles, Mauritius are middle-income countries, but middle-income countries who depend on remittances and trade or tourism. And all of this had shut down. So maybe Seychelles and Mauritius became even more vulnerable than Uganda. So there is no need rushing to support Uganda if you're not rushing to support Egypt and Tunisia. So in some sense, the interconnectedness of our economies became quite important. But also, 40 years ago, 75% of Africa's economies were the poorest, low-income countries. Today, we have almost 60% of our economy, which is middle income or lower middle income countries. So we need to acknowledge that movement in sort of the economic tissue of the continent. 75% of Africa's exports into Europe happen in the top end of the high middle income countries. So if we want to keep, and our imports, the same for our imports, if we want to keep jobs in Europe, we want to make sure that Egypt and Nigeria and Tunisia are open, and so that there is that interconnectedness. So I think that was the reason why we were calling for an all of Africa response. Now, the 26 countries that are eligible as of now for the debt service initiative, 9 of them have actually accessed the facility. There has been, and this is your question, why have we seen some sort of slowness to get to the facility? I think first the facility kicked off May 1, but first there was a sort of a sense of we needed to understand, what exactly was the facility doing, clarify some of the wording. The Economic Commission for Africa has held a number of meetings with finance ministers to explain that. Very thankful to the G20 Secretariat and the Paris Club team for coming and joining us to sort of, enlighten the ministers of finance. But something has changed, and I think this was again the sort of lack of appreciation from the G20 is this movement to middle income, this movement to a bigger share of private sector debt in Africa's debt accounts. And so the African ministers are saying we need to keep access to markets. We need to ensure that we have access to markets. So we are not going to do anything that endangers our access to markets, including taking the DSSI. So we needed to unpack what the DSSI meant and ensure that the DSSI did not prevent access to markets. It turns out it does not. However, the rating agencies have decided, Standards & Poor's and Fitch have said, you take the DSSI, we don't have any problems with it. Moody's has decided if you take the DSSI, it means that it's a sign of a liquidity strain, so we will put you on review. And that has created a little bit of sort of an angst in the system where the countries are saying, oh, but is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's not a downgrade, it's not a default, but it just gives a sense you're not healthy. But Moody's has now put 150 countries globally on review. So we're telling the African countries, this is a wash, and so please just go ahead and get it. The other issue
and also quite a few of African countries don't really have market access yet.
Exactly.
So in a way, for them, this is not really an important
issue. This doesn't matter.
Issue.
It doesn't make any difference. Exactly. Yes. And for all those African countries that do not have, actually, it's interesting because when we talk about market access, there are two kinds of market access. The one that we all know, which is Eurobonds.
Right.
But then there's the commercial banks. And there are many more. And the commercial banks, interestingly enough, in some cases are the most difficult because in some of the commercial bank lending, we have cross default clauses, which says if you take the DSSI, I could consider you in default.
Even if you have the agreement of the other lender, does it?
Exactly.
Which seems a very strange.
It seems very, very strange, and we have reached out to the Institute of International Finance to say, this looks really strange, this only happens in Africa, can we review this? Very happy to say they're reviewing it. Hopefully we will get a response by Friday with some movement in the right direction on that, because it really just seems quite... so that has been one of the other reasons why some of the countries, even though they did not have Eurobond market access, had commercial bank access, and have been worrying about this waiver. We're hoping that with the IIF we could work together to get some sort of a blanket waiver agreement which allows most of these countries to come through. And then the final issue where there was some, I think, discussion was about, whether if you took the bilateral DSSI, you were going to continue to have market access. But it's clear also in the G20 statement that you will continue to have market access. If you had a fund program, the market access agreed with the fund will stay. And if you didn't have a fund program, you can have a discussion with the fund, but you can continue to have market access. So now I think hopefully in the next 2 weeks, we will see a huge wave of African countries come forward.
That's good news. And on the bilateral official donors, there was also some initial lack of clarity or confusion about which institutions in China were part of or not part of this. And I think that also led to some ambiguity, at least in the minds of people, as to what was covered. Has that now, in your mind, do most African finance ministers feel that's sort of relatively clear? They know what's covered, what's not covered on the bilateral side and are moving forward? Or is there still stuff to be done on that to be clear about it?
There's still a lot to be done. I mean, that's a good question. I think, unfortunately, of the 9 countries that have finalized the DSSI process, no one of them has China included, which means that there is still, essentially, China is not participating in the DSSI. We've reached out to the Chinese government and to the Ministry of Finance to sort of say, can we support a process of education and facilitation of the process. I think what we're now trying to do is understand whether, each country needs almost to go to Exim Bank, to China Development Bank. So it's almost an individual process because apparently each of these agencies has a different set of agreements. And we had thought maybe that we could say that every agreement that had a government guarantee was then backed by the state and fell on the public sector DSSI. It doesn't seem to be that straightforward. So we're hoping that in the next 10 days as well, we can open up some of this conversation with China. Happy to say that the president of China is going to be meeting with African leaders tomorrow
Yes.
And so we hope that some of these issues can be brought to the fore. It is particularly important. Remember, I started by saying $8.2 billion to China. So China's participation in this process is critical for it to succeed.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think clearly, China's large financier of development projects in Africa will continue to be a big partner, and so you have to find a cooperative solution to this. But it is important that we find a solution that minimizes both the time that is being lost in sorting these things out and the admin cost. I mean, African finance ministers have a lot of things they need to get done right now. And the last thing you need is to sort of spend 3/4 of your day working with lender by lender by lender at the retail level, trying to go over the same set of issues over and over again. It's just not a very productive way to occupy policymakers' time at this moment. Well, I want to sort of move from that to the private sector part. So, there's been some talk about should we try to get, the private sector is an important creditor and they could provide a standstill and that would be helpful. But there is also a concern that if you even talk to the private sector about it, the rating agencies get a little anxious and so many countries are very reluctant, hesitant to do that. Where do you think this is going now? What's your sense of private sector participation?
I think two things, and I think we have to be very clear. When the finance ministers, together with the Economic Commission for Africa, called for across the board standstill, they were also very clear in segmenting, the approach to the private creditors. And at the time, we talked about putting in place a special purpose vehicle that will deal with the private sector component of the debt service suspension initiative. That was because we knew that a sort of standstill in the strictest form as applied to the bilateral side would never hold for the private sector. I think there has been, over the past 6 weeks, a lot of confusion in the system about whether or not the African finance ministers wanted a standstill from the private sector. I don't think we wanted a standstill a la DSSI. We don't want a moratorium. We want an instrument, a financial instrument that will allow us to honor every obligation that we have with the private creditors, but at the same time generate some more liquidity for the countries, because that's essentially what the public DSSI does. It gives countries liquidity for 18 months, we hope, to sort of continue. And so what we thought, and so we've had different ideas, Brady bonds, repo market type instrument that we can actually, put out there that will allow countries, through this new vehicle to honor all their obligations, but at the same time maintain some liquidity in-house. And I think that's the right approach to this. I don't think that there is any appetite. Actually, I am convinced, I know that there is no appetite on the continent for any kind of moratorium on the private creditor side. I don't think that the private creditors either have any appetite for any kind of moratorium on that side. And I think that the rating agencies for sure are looking at any kind of default, any kind of conversation around suspension, and these countries will be downgraded severely. And let's remember, we are not talking about a downgrade from an A+ to a BBB. We're talking about, something much less into junk category or shutting your access to markets, which is not affordable for
nobody wants that, because I think everybody, if you think about the future, people are thinking about where they will get their finance in the future, and I think people are very wary, rightly, about taking steps that are going to jeopardize future access. Now, as you say, I think it is important to move quickly from what is a little bit of a sort of dialogue that's going past each other to try and have a constructive conversation around, well, what are the ways in which we could have more liquidity during this period? And also a conversation which doesn't trigger alarm bells just by having the conversation, and then has the sort of side consequences that you mentioned. Well, what about the IFI response? So initially very quick, IMF came in with a number of countries, provided emergency funding. The World Bank, IDA, also came in with a number of countries. Now, this crisis is going to take longer, so we need to go around with a second round of support, because it's not just going to be through that second round will become a little bit more complicated because it's a question of whether you think of it as more emergency funding or whether you think of it as part of sort of regular instrument packages that these institutions have to support budgets and balance of payments over the longer term. Do you feel that that's coming along as the African finance ministers anticipate? Are you feeling, how good are you feeling, and the finance ministers, more importantly, feeling about moving beyond the sort of first round of immediate support to being able to tackle some of the longer term needs and including the sort of thinking about the recovery phase?
I think we're not feeling very optimistic, but I think that it's very difficult to find optimism anyway in these days for two reasons. The first one is, first of all, the IMF has done an amazing job of coming forward. The World Bank, together, I think they had about $40 billion disbursed to the continent already, but they're also running out of liquidity themselves. So in some sense, the sort of the well is getting dry. And so what we also then need to do now is work really hard to see whether we can avail more resources to the IMF and whether we can avail more resources to the World Bank. So we're actually no longer looking for resources for Africa. We're looking for more resources for the World Bank and the IMF so that they can in turn put it into the continent. And so that is, of course, going to slow down the process a little bit. But we hope that, the international community will come together.
I sort of feel they've got slightly deeper pockets here. I mean, I kind of wonder, the IMF has $1 trillion, so let's, 27 billion.
But you see, they have a quota system and they have, who they can allocate it to. And some of those countries have already hit their maximum limits. And we're trying to see whether we can double. In some cases, they've already doubled access. So there are still some, and this is, I think, the other point is revising and reviewing the international financial
how to mobilize the liquidity that exists as well as looking for more. Right.
Yeah. So the World Bank is saying we have a 3-year replenishment period. If we front load everything, we won't have everything at the back end. So we need a commitment that somebody will replenish us early before we can do something, and which is, I think, justifiable because we still need to think about the build back period. And so, so we now have sort of multiple conversations going in the system. But I think that's why keeping access to the financial markets is so critical. Because while we deal with sort of the traditional institutions and the traditional processes, we need to get, quick, ready, and speedy access to markets. The good thing about it is that spreads that went up and spiked in March are beginning to come down a little bit for most countries. But in the next 18 months, we're still going to have some pressures, and that's why creating some kind of a vehicle that allows to mutualize access to markets will be an important part of how we see the next 18 months and getting out of this crisis into building back better.
Let's just talk a little bit to conclude around this sort of building back better. So one part, of course, is, where we focus the building back effort, making sure that, we think about the climate change dimension, which we were beginning to focus on more and more, and it's been a little bit put on hold for a moment, but it's just as important going forward. I think the other part would be how to think about inequality and vulnerability, think about gender. If you think about, there are all these long-term fractures and weaknesses in all our societies. I mean, not just in Africa, actually, wherever we sit. I'm having this conversation with you sitting in Washington right now, and right around me, we are seeing some of the consequences of long-term institutionalized racism, discrimination against vulnerable groups come forth in ways that remind us of what we've neglected. And so as we think about building back anywhere, including in Africa, we have to learn some of the lessons of the things that we neglected to tackle enough in the past. And so how much is that part of the conversation? Are we learning from the gendered response we had to some of the Ebola crisis, the fact that, when some of the girls leave school and they either don't come back or at all, more likely not to come back, how do we factor those dimensions into our response? How much is that being done?
No, I think that's a very good question. I think some of it is being done. It will be fair to say, not all. I think what we are seeing is in West Africa, where there was sort of, the Ebola crisis, some of those responses actually immediately the COVID pandemic hit, the solutions for Ebola were immediately sort of kicked in. And, in Senegal, fantastic job of using midwives, using local religious leaders. That whole sort of tracing process sort of kicked in and went well. I think that the sustainability point is the most important because it even goes into the gender point. And some of the work that we've been doing is looking at energy sustainability. And, you talk about energy, you talk about breathing, you talk about cooking stoves, you talk about industrialization and SMEs. And it actually hits everybody in some way or the other. And just before the crisis, we had launched with the private sector a Sustainable Development Goal 7 initiative. And we're hoping that, we didn't put it in the back burner. We're actually bringing it forward to say we can actually use this as an instrument for, solving the crisis and building back better, and looking at how we respond to women. But the issue, again, and so there's that energy underpinning and sustainability, but most importantly, back to, technology, access to the internet. Most of these women are small and medium enterprises that need to sort of get to markets. They can't do the traveling. The sort of with the lockdowns, it's become even more difficult. And so we need to find other platforms through which they can reach their markets. And so technology becomes an important part of keeping some financing in their hands. And then finally, of course, education. We have almost 330 million kids out of school. Inequality and gender come into play because then the girls, you look around and you go, okay, well, she's almost marrying age. Why don't we just marry her off? And so you see immediately that, violence, early marriages and all that start happening again. And so one of the things we're also sort of working at is to say, can we reach those communities? Can we find alternative ways of continuing education? Can you even find and redefine social safety nets, as we did in the Ebola time, that say that if you keep your daughter in school or if you don't marry her off, you get an additional savings. So I think the beauty of this is that, Africa had learned from some lessons. We are not, waiting for somebody to give us those solutions. We have them now inbuilt. And again, I think a nice way of ending is to just say that the maturity that the continent has demonstrated across the board, even, you would have heard all of Africa saying, give us debt cancellation. We're not saying that. We're saying, we want to keep access to markets open. We want to keep our jobs. It's a whole different dialogue. And I think that there has to be an appreciation of this growth. And finally, on the inequality conversation and what, you're seeing there in Washington and that is this whole issue of, voice in our larger institutions. And so we do need at some point, as we face crisis after crisis. And remember in 2008 when we had the financial crisis, the IMF, we created SDRs to save Europe and the United States. Why can't we do the same for Africa? And why has it become so difficult? It's because we don't have the voice. And so I think that some of this sort of inequality, institutional inequalities in our systems that make it difficult to respond to some of these crises will have to be things that we pick up as we go forward.
Well, Vera, all I would say is that I think Africa has drawn lessons from its own experiences. But I think, right now there are a lot of things happening in the response to this crisis where the rest of the world can draw lessons from the reactions of African policymakers. And the quest for voice is one that, this is yet another manifestation and demonstration of why it's so important to have that voice. So all I can say to you is that your voice is certainly one that matters and people are listening to. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. And I hope that in a few months we can reconvene and see whether we are both in terms of where things are moving forward and what additional lessons we can draw. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Masood. Thank you. Stay safe. Always a pleasure. And hopefully one of these days we'll be able to see each other and talk to each other from across the table. Thank
Indeed.
you.
Look forward to that.